Why are 46% of stalking victims being given psychiatric medication? This is written by Dr. Jessica Taylor, March 26, 2025, and printed in What Would Just Say Substack.com. We need to talk about the pathologization of women who have been stalked. You know, for 15 years in the job, there are a few things left that literally make her want to hang my head on a wall. Or actually, maybe there are increasingly more things that would make me want to headbutt a wall. I'll have to think on that one. I like her. Anyway, telling women who are being stalked that their trauma is a mental disorder and then prescribing them psychiatric medication while doing sweet nothing about the stalker has to be one of those, well, where's the closest wall moments. She's been writing a lot about stalking and is recently working with some police forces on the responses to stalking. And as part of some of that work, was asked to write about the health impacts of stalking on women. When I tell you I had to take a step away from my desk when I was ready to read this research, there is medical gaslighting at its finest, traumatized from being stalked. Of course, now it's paranoid schizophrenia, depression, anxiety, and maybe a touch of delusional disorder. Well, take these pills and stop calling the police. A recent study by Short and others in 2023 examined the impact of stalking on the physical and psychological well-being of 105 victims and their experiences in accessing healthcare services. The results highlighted significant health consequences following experiences of stalking. Prior to the stalking, 86% of respondents reported no health concerns. However, post-stalking, 74% reported developing health issues, with 23% sustaining physical injuries as a direct result of the stalking. Additionally, while only 30% of the participants had any pre-existing mental disorder diagnosis, this figure increased dramatically to 95% after being stalked. You read that right. After being stalked, 95% of women were diagnosed with mental disorders. Fabulous. Well, that's not going to prejudice a case either at all, will it? Psychological and physical impact of stalking. Stalking has severe implications for victims' mental and physical health, with well-documented links to later diagnosis such as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, depression, panic disorder, and anxiety, at a greater risk of physical harm, substance misuse, and the development of conditions such as hypertension and cardiac disease. And then we find that the victims, as they try to disengage from their stalker, often leads to even farther harm, frequently escalating the behavior when they are met with resistance. Fear and distress among stalking victims are not irrational. Research on stalking behaviors were present in 94% of homicides reviewed. 60% of stalking victims accessed healthcare services as a direct result. And the breakdown of services accessed was as followed. 66% consulted their GP, 38% accessed counseling services or mental health support, 6% attended A&E, 7% sought support from health visitors, 22% access victim support or specialist stalking services, and 8% engaged with domestic violence services. In 24% of cases, healthcare professionals referred victims to counseling services. However, those who sought medical support, only 33% felt that the professionals they disclosed to understood their experience. 28% of victims believed that their healthcare provider did not recognize the impact stalking had on their lives, and 11% reported feeling dismissed, disbelieved, or that their concern was not taken seriously. As noted earlier, one of the most concerning findings was that 46% of stalking victims were prescribed psychiatric medication, despite the fact that they were not mentally ill, but rather being subjected to endless trauma as a result of being stalked. Of those prescribed medications, 61% reported that it made no difference or made them feel worse, while 6% refused to take the prescribed medication. The most commonly prescribed medications to women who were being stalked were Sterling, 11%, citalopram, 8%, diazepam, 5%. 10% were prescribed multiple medications from multiple mental disorders all at once. This raises serious concerns about the medicalization of stalking victims and the potential for misdiagnosis. The health and trauma impact of stalking is significant, and yet responses from healthcare, police, and social care professionals often fail to reflect the severity of its efforts. The widespread prescription of psychiatric medication to stalking victims, despite many experiencing trauma rather than a mental illness, is particularly concerning. For professionals working with stalking victims, the priority should be in recognizing stalking as a serious form of psychological abuse and a criminal behavior, rather than framing victims' distress as an individual mental health issue. The pathologization of women who are being stalked. Many women who are stalked will exhibit symptoms entirely consistent with trauma, including hypervigilance, anxiety, difficulty sleeping, catastrophic thinking, isolation, withdrawal, and panic episodes. However, rather than recognizing these as expected responses to an ongoing threat, professionals may mistakenly interpret them as indicators of a primary mental illness. This is leading us to inappropriate prescribing of psychiatric medication rather than addressing the stalking, which has multiple negative implications for a victim, especially in legal contexts. Many victims experience complete disruption to their lives. Their daily routines may become entirely shaped by efforts to avoid the perpetrator, leading to social withdrawal, difficulty concentrating, emotional numbness, and exhaustion. In extreme cases, victims may feel that their world has become unmanageable, struggling to maintain employment, relationships, or a sense of normalcy. Victims may even become suicidal or engage in self-harm. Rather than recognizing these as predictable responses to stalking-related trauma, professionals policing and persecution, social care, and health care often view them through a psychiatric lens, misunderstanding or ignoring the sources of distress. Victims may be diagnosed with mental health disorders, such as borderline personality disorder, schizophrenia, or delusional disorder, particularly when they attempt to explain patterns of harassment that others cannot immediately see. In some cases, they are prescribed unnecessary psychiatric medication involving antidepressants, sedatives, and even antipsychotics, when their distress stems not from a disorder, but from a real ongoing threat to their safety. This process of medicalization shifts the focus away from addressing the stalking itself, forcing victims to manage their distress and isolation while perpetrators continue unchecked. The systemic failure plays directly into the hands of offenders when the victims are dismissed as paranoid, unstable, or exaggerating. Their credibility in legal environments such as police investigations, criminal court, or family court is undermined, reducing the likelihood of effective intervention. Stalkers, particularly ex-intimate partners, are adept at using these narratives to their advantage, painting their victim as irrational, paranoid, unstable, liars, overreacting to professionals, the courts, or even mutual acquaintances. As a result, victims are not only left unprotected, but are actively harmed by a system that labels them as mentally ill, rather than as individuals experiencing prolonged stalking and violence. The consequences of this misidentification are severe. It delays or prevents intervention, leaving victims trapped in a cycle of distress while allowing perpetrators to continue. It reinforces the power dynamic between stalker and victim, as the very systems designed to protect become complicit in minimizing the abuse and stalking. Worse still, it creates secondary trauma, as victims face systematic disbelief, invalidation, and inappropriate medical treatment that further isolates them. In cases where victims return to their stalker as a means of seeking temporary respite from the intrusions, usually when measures and systems have failed to protect them, this evokes an unsympathetic or even hostile response from police and social care, who accuse the victim of asking for the abuse, lying about the stalking, or becoming complicit. The risk of pathologizing the victims of stalking. The victim is framed as mentally disordered, which impacts credibility in legal proceedings. The victim can begin to believe that they have something fundamentally wrong with them. The victim can begin to blame themselves for being stalked. Agencies may disbelieve or ignore the victim as they are labeled as having mental health issues. The trauma of the stalking is never validated, causing further distress and secondary trauma to the victim. The victim may experience an escalation of their trauma responses and coping mechanisms due to being pathologized, possibly leading to suicide or self-harm. Misuse of unnecessary psychiatric medication with side effects and medical implications for a non-existent mental disorder. Mental disorder diagnoses stay on medical history of the victim for the rest of their lives, impacting employment, insurance, mortgages, and other policies. The stalker can gaslight the victim and convince agencies that the victim is delusional, attention-seeking, or lying. A fundamental shift is required in our professional responses to stalking. Trauma responses must be recognized for what they are: a natural reaction to persistent threat, fear, violence, and stalking, not an indication of mental illness. Effective safeguarding requires prioritizing victim protection over medical intervention, ensuring that stalking cases are addressed through disrupting the perpetrator rather than sedating the victim. Without this shift, the criminal justice and healthcare systems will continue to fail women by reinforcing the very structures that allow stalking to persist. At the end, she says that she recognizes that as a victim of stalking herself, this particular article may be useful for those struggling with being stalked, and she invites you to please reach out to her. Dr. Jessica Taylor.